I am excited to dig into this fifth and final segment in our series on listening. If you haven't been here, we've been talking a lot about listening, and we've been kind of on this mission of leading listening lives. We've been on this mission of centering our whole selves, our ears and our minds and our hearts, and posturing ourselves to receive the information from something specific. And in this last and final segment of our series, I'm really doubling down on what I've been saying for like the past 5 weeks. I've been really consistent in saying that listening is the answer to everything. Listening is the answer to everything we deal with, everything we experience, as well as how we live into the redeemed life that Christ already paid for, right? And so as we have been considering listening, we have leaned deeply into a prayer found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's called the Shema prayer. And we've been learning about how it's the most important prayer in the Jewish culture. I want to read what it says. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your mind and with all of your soul and with all of your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." And I've really been impressing upon us that the reality is, in the most important Jewish custom, it begins not with the word behave, not with the word study, not with the word serve or pray or even love. It begins with the word Shema, which means to hear and to respond. And so each week we've really been thinking deeply about what Paul regards as important for us to listen to. He calls them groans. And we've picked up these groans from our point passage for the series, which is Romans chapter 8, verses 22 through 27. Excuse me. Verse 22 says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." And so the first week we talked about the groans and sermons that we hear from creation and how important it is to listen to them. And then the Roman passage continues with verse 23. It says, "Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies." And so we talked in that second week, we considered the implications of listening to the groans and sermons of our bodies, of our lives, of what's going on within us. And we were really honest about how challenging it is to hear what's going on inside of us, especially when it doesn't sound so nice. And then last week we talked a lot about verse 24, which says, "For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they have already? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans." How many of you are glad that the Spirit intercedes for us when we don't know what to pray? Thank you, God. "And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God." And so last week, we examined this idea of listening to God. And we talked freely about how beautifully challenging that is for us, but also how important it is to our lives. I mean, we are Christ followers. It pays to listen to Christ. And we talked about how God speaks to us in multiple venues and in multiple arenas. And then we unpacked some methods for how we can discern if what we're hearing is actually from God. The last verse in the passage that has been a part of our series is verse 28, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." And I think that this verse is skillfully placed there by Paul who realizes that he's just given this laundry list of groans. Creation is groaning, you're groaning, I'm groaning, God's groaning, everything is groaning, and yet all things work together for the good of them that love the Lord. Paul says everything is going to be okay. Creation is falling apart, global warming is real, but everything is going to be okay. You're going through stuff in your own lives, problems and trials in your body and your health, but everything is going to be all right, inevitably, because everything is moving toward redemption. Look to somebody and tell them everything is going to be all right. Help me minister and help me minister. I know you're not on payroll, but help me. This week, I want to talk about the application of being good listeners. And I want to talk about it in a way that I hope is really practical and really useful. We're going to talk about listening to each other, listening to people, and particularly people in pain. And I believe that if you lean wholeheartedly into our teaching this morning, I believe that it will bless every area of your lives. So with that being said, let's ask God to speak to us. Speak, Lord, your servants are listening. Father, I just pray that you would give us agility of thought, God, and a softness of heart, God, that we might hear what it is that you have for us. Both corporately and as individuals, God, speak to us. We want to learn from you. We come here to sit at your feet and hear your good teaching. So God, place a gate over my mouth that nothing I say would be antithetical to your will, God, and pierce through, as Peter said, the fog that may be around our hearts and our heads, that we might leave transformed and different and deepened. Have your way this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, so I want to build our message this morning on two premises, right? The first premise is real easy. It's just that life is hard. Somebody say life is hard. I don't care where you're from, who you know, what color you are. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how much education you have. Life is hard. Sunny seasons are often preceded and succeeded by stormy ones. And so life is kind of this ebb and flow of good times and hellish times, and better times and hellfire times. And so, first premise, life is hard. The second premise is that we really don't know how to respond to each other well. And again, I don't care who you are, where you're from, we really don't know how to respond to each other well. I don't care what family you point to in this sanctuary, they got some problems. I don't care how nice they dress when they come here. I don't care how cute they look when they cuddle up and sit next to each other on the pew. Everybody has some problems. I was thinking about how it was just Adam and Eve, and they had problems. I was thinking about how the first family, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, and they were dealing with murder. So anytime you have more than one person, anytime you have a group of people, you're going to have problems because we don't know how to respond to each other well, particularly in difficult moments or in moments of pain and challenging times. And I think that one of the reasons that we have to get so serious about listening is because we miss things when we aren't. We miss things that could really alleviate so much of the things that we deal with each other. If we were serious about listening, we miss layers of meaning and opportunities for connection that are below the surface, and we miss them. And I'll tell you this, Living Grace Fellowship, if our mission is truly to encourage life-changing relationships with Jesus Christ, you and I have to become masterful listeners. If we really want to live into our mission, we have to become masterful listeners. I realized as I was preparing this that a church with people who felt heard would grow like crazy. It's more important than good music. It's more important than a good preacher. It's more important than owning your own building. We would grow like crazy, and not just numerically. We can stay the same size as long as we're growing spiritually and emotionally, as long as our discipleship is elevating, as long as we're growing relationally. And so you and I have to become masterful listeners, not just for the potential strangers that may or may not come, but for each other. I realized that I was missing opportunities and not hearing things from people that I loved most, people that I have deep relationship with, people that I have lived with, because I wasn't serious about listening. And I'll tell you, it's real easy to become comfortable with being deaf. Kiara and I are considering taking some sign language courses. One of the things that we're kind of playing around is the idea and thinking about is, where do deaf people go to church, right? Like is it accessible? And we want to be a place that's accessible. And so I went and I met with the dean at ARC over the sign language program. And one of the things that has struck me most is that learning the signs, that's the easy part. It's learning deaf culture that's really, really interesting. And one thing that I found, it just blew my mind, is if you ask the majority of people who are deaf if they would prefer to hear, they'll tell you no. They will tell you they would prefer to be deaf. And I realized that it's comfortable to not hear. I was talking to somebody last week, and in our conversation, I realized that the thing that's going to be most uncomfortable about this new setup of chairs, about this new way of kind of doing things, about stretching and the ways that we've been stretching, is that it demands an intimacy that we're not really sure that we want. Oh, come on, we're going to tell the truth today. Americans in general have built a subconscious habit of trying to escape deep connection, with the exception of where it's mandatory, i.e., if you're not my wife and you're not my children, God bless. I'll come to church, I'll shake your hand, I'll have a cup of coffee with you, but you can keep your business to yourself. I'm going to keep mine to myself. I'll see you next Saturday. If it's not mandatory, we don't want it. And I'll say, even those connections that are mandatory with spouses and children, some of y'all, never mind, I'm not going to talk about y'all. I want to present you a new requirement of being in a faith community. I believe that this requirement needs to stand above all else. As a church member, the people in our church and in our lives need to know that when they come to us with whatever is on their heart and mind, they will be heard. We have to be dedicated to hearing the hearts of those around us. Notice I didn't say anything about proclaiming the gospel, baptizing people, making disciples, and it's because I believe that the act of skillful listening embodies the gospel and paves the road for all of the things we like to attribute to good Christianity. So if you're like me, you're probably not real good at this. You're probably wondering, how do I become a better listener? How do I become better at listening to people? And the first thing that I'll tell you, I just have 4 simple words for you. Stay in the feeling. We have a tendency to run from feelings, both our own and other people's. And what that results in is when we encounter someone who has the courage to share where they are with us, in one way or another, we tell them not to feel what they feel. Somebody comes to us, they say, I'm going through something. God's in control. Don't feel it. This is going to make you stronger. Don't feel it. This too will pass. Don't feel it. God won't test you beyond what you can handle. Don't feel it. I have to be really careful, even when I am quoting the Bible and I say something like, all things work together, everything's going to be all right. I have to be really, really careful that I am not doing that in a way that communicates that you don't get to feel what you feel. We'll use humor to divert feelings. We'll argue with folks over their feelings. We'll even pray folks out of their feelings, won't we? I'll just talk about me. I shared when we were discussing listening to ourselves a few weeks ago, I said that this way of being where we run from our feelings is really indicative of the way we treat ourselves. We have such little capacity for navigating the terrain of our own emotional world, and so we aren't skilled in the practice of sitting in someone else's. But I'll tell you this, the best listening in the world happens when you sit. So how do you become a better listener? You stay in the feeling, your own and what you experience from someone else. Now I'm going to come back to that in a little bit because I want to acknowledge something. I recognize that I could give all the best tools for listening, all of the best techniques. I could introduce fancy words. We could talk about mirroring and paraphrasing and asking questions, and still not bear the fruit of being good listeners. You can take notes and pay attention to everything I say and still not be a good listener. And that's because a person's ability to listen well is not determined by the tools in his or her toolbox. And it's similar to the way that the law does not have the capacity to produce life. Tools don't have the capacity to produce listeners. And so today is not about guilting you into listening or delineating some list of rules for listening. In fact, what I want to do is take the list out of listening. I don't think listening should be mechanical. What I really want to do today is wake up the hunger inside of you to acquire a listening heart. If I wanted to use good Bible terms, I'd say a redeemed heart. I really, one of my favorite characters in the Bible is David. But if you study David, you got to, study all about David. And he had a son whose name was Solomon, and Solomon had everything. I mean, Solomon was wealthy. I mean, money. Solomon was brilliant. He was wise. He was a great military mastermind, and he had women. And women from all over the place. He had Asian women and African women and Spanish women. And I've been to, anyway, I won't go too far there. Solomon had a whole bunch of stuff. But in 1 Kings, when the Lord asked Solomon what he wanted, Solomon didn't say, I want more riches. He didn't say, I want to keep what I have. Most translations say that Solomon asked for an understanding heart. And guess what word we translate to mean understanding? The word Shema. It is a variation of Shema. Solomon asked for a heart that hears and responds because he recognized that it was a necessity for what he was doing. And so that's my prayer too. I recognize that the what of listening is not nearly as important as the who of listening. Who do I have to become to have the capacity to listen well? It's one thing to season your talking with a little bit of listening, kind of like how, you give a little sugar cube to make the medicine go down. But are we truly motivated to learn how to listen to others? Because I'll tell you this, straight up, listening well has costs. Character development is always expensive for the ego. And so I hope this morning you're willing to try. Let's do a little bit of honest self-reflection. For what purpose do you enter a conversation? Is it a chance to express your opinion? Is it an opportunity to be heard? Is it an opportunity to impress or to entertain, to prove that you're likable or smart enough or good enough? Is it a chance to prove your morality? Do we enter conversations to persuade or problem solve or convince? What is your agenda for conversation? How do you view the other person in the conversation? Who's the expert? Who's the novice? Is the other person simply an audience? I I tell you this, as I dig deep into myself, I found that so often the motivations for my conversation are selfish. And this is problematic because the opposite of a listening heart is not a talkative heart, it's a selfish heart. That's really what listening costs. Listening is the war against the entrenched selfishness of the human heart. In a small way, a listening heart is supposed to mirror the self-emptying posture of Jesus. It seeks to put away all control and all of the ways that we try to manipulate conversation, all of the agendas we have for conversation for our own gain. The listening heart submits to Paul's teaching. And in Ephesus, Paul told them, he said, submit to one another in reverence for Christ. And I realized our seriousness about listening reflects our humility toward Jesus. I felt so convicted when I realized that trying to fix or judge or rescue or change somebody is an exertion of power. It's a power move. It's power over somebody because instead of trying to enter someone else's space, we're forcing them to try to enter ours. Listening is about relinquishing power. And it's quite the opposite of our cultural understanding of conversation. It kind of turns that on its head. And again, it mirrors God as a servant, God who would enter the world of humanity. It mirrors a Jesus who would wash the feet of his students. And I want to be clear, because I don't want you to fall into the trap of thinking that good listening is just for the people that you're deeply connected with. We don't listen to a person. We are required to listen to people. It is pharisaical to try to triage who you get to listen well to. We listen to people who are complex, people who are multifaceted, people who are beautiful and wounded and contradictory and broken and strange, people who are beloved image bearers of the Creator. Minds and hearts and souls and bodies spilling over with passions and dreams and fears and hopes. And we who know how precious people are, even the a-holes, we who know that have to treat carefully our hearing of their hearts. And so I want to make a suggestion that we start listening to instead of listening for. To listen for is to break people down. It's to reduce people to parts, to put them into categories, to reduce them to issues and positions and problems to be solved, as opposed to listening in an effort to see people as a whole. When Jesus met the woman at the well, she saw herself and him in parts. She said, I'm a Samaritan. I'm a woman. I'm parts. You are a Jewish man, a rabbi. I cannot be in relationship with you because I have reduced us to parts and pieces. And Jesus said, girl, if you only knew how much bigger this thing is. He saw her as an entire being. He saw that her small parts are attached to big parts, big memories, big dreams, big fears, big losses, big experiences. Listening to is the authentic invitation to let folks be themselves. Listening says, as Jesus said, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, where you come from, what you look like, what you've been through, what you've done right, what you've done wrong. You are welcome in my space. So I told y'all that listening is not so much about technique, it's about heart, and I meant that. And I think the challenge is that most of us already think we're good listeners. Bad listening is real good at masquerading as good listening. And so I want to give you some profiles of some bad listeners, and I just want you to take an honest inventory of where you find yourself. Can we do that? And then I'll get out your way. I'm trying to hurt some feelings this morning. That's all right, though. My paycheck gonna come. I'm not part of the government. Bad listener number one. Grant, there's gonna be some slides that go with this. The one-up. The one-up person says, you think that's something? Let me tell you about what happened last week. This listener will sit quietly through the other person's story and then try to trump the other person's story with something more interesting, more entertaining, bad, more challenging. They turn the conversation into a competition. We got some one-ups in here. You ain't got to tell nobody. Y'all just look at me. Don't worry about who you sit next to. Bad listener number two, the sleight of hand, or the reroute, as I like to call them. This person says, that's great, but what I really want to talk about. This person says, that reminds me, speaking of, this person says, did you have a good weekend? Because, my weekend was... This listener listens for the sake of pushing their own agenda. They'll sit there quietly and listen to you, but just long enough so that they can start talking about what they want to talk about. Do we have some rerouters in the house? Maybe not. Maybe you're an inspector. Well, didn't you say last week that, no, if I remember correctly, you told me. This listener asks a series of close-ended questions in a way that feels like a detective trying to get a confession out of somebody. It's like the lightning before the thunder. This person seeks to trap you. They listen so that they can get some ammunition. Maybe you're an inspector. Maybe not. Maybe you're an interrogator. The interrogator, what do you think about it? And what's your favorite? And why are you moving to it? And what time are you going to get here? And when... This listener has gotten wind of the idea that asking questions is a part of good listening, and they just rattle them off at you, just pepper you with questions like we're playing a game of dodgeball, and then use questions to control the conversation. While questions are a really good method for good listening, they also can be a way of control. Maybe we got some interrogators in the house, I don't know. Maybe you're a projector. The projector says, I'm totally dealing with the same thing. My mom also is. And this listener projects his feelings and his circumstances and problems on to the other person and then tries to project their solutions onto the other person. This speaker inserts himself into every single part of the conversation. They'll turn it back on them in a second. How you doing? I'm good. Oh, I'm not so good myself because Maybe you're a projector. Then there are folks that hijack conversations. This listener will wait until you're done speaking and then start talking about something completely different. This person doesn't even try to use a word to transition. This person, I went to the store yesterday and I bought a bag of meat. Well, I went and got gas on Friday. It's like two ships just passing by each other. Then you have people who are mechanics. Here's what you need to do. I'm one of them, don't worry. If you're feeling a little uncomfortable, just stay with me. This person listens in a conversation like they're a mechanic listening to an engine sputter, trying to diagnose the problem. The hard part about people who are mechanics is that they think because they're trying to help and because they're trying to problem solve, and maybe they're even offering their own resources, that they're being good listeners. I have a feeling we got some mechanics in here. Then there's the debater. It's pretty self-explanatory. This person likes to argue and listens only for the point that they disagree with. They might agree with 99% of what you said, but that one point, as a preacher, we get these people all the time. Dwight, that was a good sermon, but I noticed you didn't pause and there's a comma after that word in the Hebrew text. Then you have people who are deflectors. Yeah, but these listeners are usually folks who have a hard time receiving criticism. Someone offers them feedback and they immediately turn it back on you. Dwight, you need to speak a little slower. Yeah, but you don't speak at all. And then there's, and this is probably my favorite, the Great Wall of China. Yep. Sure. This listener will face you with glazed eyes, nodding occasionally, and looking for the first exit out of that conversation because listening is too much work. Where do you fall? I know I saw myself in just about all of them. Oh, it hurt my feelings. I threw the whole book away. I went and got it later, but it lived in my trash can for 2 days. The challenge is if you ask these bad listeners, they really believe that they're good listeners. We really believe that we're good listeners. Especially because we'll say, well, I didn't interrupt. I sat quietly and waited till you were done. We equate silence with listening. These are not synonyms. Listening is about what you're doing when you're not saying anything. It's not about the fact that you're not saying anything. It's real easy for me to be in a conversation and focus on my inner monologue and what's going on in my head and what's coming in an hour. It's real easy to play the part of a listener and not do a good job listening. Oh, I wish I had time to really unpack this. We'd be here all day. Listen, I'll make it simple. Listening is the scandalous premise that the conversation is not about you. The conversation is not about you. The gravitational pull of our broken hearts and broken minds wants to make that conversation about us, but it is not about us. Therefore, we have to be ruthless in pushing that arrow back to the other person. It wants to spin around. It's not about me. So I told you that it wasn't about technique. Listening is not all about technique. It's about new hearts being birthed. But technique helps. I want to give you just 3 points, and then I'll get out of your way for good listening. I want you to start asking open-ended questions, and not just for the sake of asking questions. Ask these open-ended questions out of a genuine curiosity for who you're talking about. Out of a place of recognizing, I don't care how long you've been married, you really don't know that person. There's still stuff you can learn about them. Open-ended questions, not yes or no questions, but questions that leave the speaker somewhere to go. I don't want you to ask, did you have a good weekend? That's yes or no. How was your weekend? And I'll tell you this, most of us can ask a good open-ended question and can answer a good open-ended question. Most of us aren't really prepared to do a follow-up question. There's something real powerful that will unlock conversation about saying, well, what made that weekend good? Tell me more about that. And again, these questions have to be birthed from a genuine place of curiosity and wonder. You have to care enough about that person to ask, how was your weekend? I'll move on. Practical tool number 1, have a genuine curiosity about people and ask them open-ended and follow-up questions. Practical tool number 2, reflect on what you hear. You are the imago Dei. You are the image of God. You are to reflect what you hear. Now, often this shows up in marriage counseling, and we've all heard that. So what I'm hearing you say is, and that's powerful. That's a powerful tool. But beyond just repeating what you hear, reflect on what you hear. It doesn't mean that you have to repeat every single thing, but it means that you lean into the experience that somebody is having. You're sifting through the words and listening for the heart and then allowing yourself to feel what they feel. And that may include some verbal response. And I'll tell you it's hard, so you're going to have to ask God to help you do it. Practical tool number 1, ask good, open-ended questions from a genuine place. Practical tool number 2, lean in and reflect what you're actually hearing. Practical tool number 3, and then I'm on my way out. I want you to start answering questions with questions. What do you mean, Dwight? Oh, I'm glad you asked. People love to ask for advice, but it's usually not because they really want advice. It's because we need the opportunity to express ourselves. We need the opportunity to discuss what we're experiencing. We need somebody to listen to us. So a simple response of, well, why do you ask? Can take your conversation deeper and more impactful. I don't want you to be so caught up on words. I want you to listen for heart. for feelings. Practical tool number 1, ask open-ended questions and good follow-up questions from a genuine place. Practical tool number 2, lean in and allow yourself to experience what they're experiencing and reflect what you hear. Practical tool number 3, answer a question with a question. I'm going to give you one more. I know I said 3, I'm going to do 4. Commit to the journey of becoming a good listener. Commit to it. Because the reality is, it's not a light switch that you can turn on and off. It's not easy. It's a discipline. It's something that takes work. Sometimes we're tired. That's why our spouses and children often get the worst listening, because we're often with them when we're most tired, after you get home from work. And so sometimes, it's healthy to say, you know what, I really want to hear this, but I'm exhausted right now. Can I call you tomorrow? Here's the truth. Half-hearted and poor listening is a sin. It's a sin. It is the original sin. It is antithetical to God's design and will for our lives. And good listening is hard work and energy. It's a slow process. It takes the long route. And I'll tell you this, your listening style mirrors your lifestyle. So it's time for us to commit to being good listeners, for us to center ourselves around receiving the messages that are all around us, the messages in creation and the messages in our own lives and the messages from other people and the messages from God and how God uses all of that to speak to us. It's time for us to build an altar and put on it all of the things that are in our way of listening, namely ourselves. Turn to your neighbor and say, climb on top of that altar. This is the last thing I'll share. Did you know that when people die, hearing is the last thing to go? I didn't know that. They train hospice workers. They say you talk to them the whole time, because even when the sight is gone and the cognition is gone and the verbal skills are gone, as the soul is moving back and forth between the barrier of this life and the next life, it is able to hear. Listening is the first thing that we do in the womb, and it's the last thing that we do. And I'll tell you, there's no glory in listening. There's more glory in talking about listening than actually listening. And yet, it is such a gift from God, shrouded in the staggering discovery that God listens to us. And so all I'll say, all I ask you is, will you embrace the gift of listening? Watch it transform your lives. Let's pray. Peter, you can come. Father God, in Jesus' name, God, I thank you for this teaching. And Father, I just pray that all the places that there were holes and flaws, and I just pray that you would fill that space and that you would drive home the reality of this message, that you would give it to them like you gave it to me, deep and rich. God, help us to become good listeners, because it is your design. We love you, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.